Imagine a man walking through life as though chasing a horizon. Every morning he wakes with a list of tasks, anxieties, and hopes. His mind is already racing before his feet even touch the floor. He thinks of the bills that need paying, the promotion he wants but hasn't earned, the mistakes of yesterday that keep replaying like a broken record. Even when he sits at his dinner table, surrounded by family, his body is there, but his mind is elsewhere. Does this sound familiar? We live in a world where everyone is running toward success, running away from failure, running after dreams, running from fears. And yet in all this running, something vital is missed, the very ground we are standing on. What if I told you that there is a door not hidden in the clouds, not waiting after death, not guarded by rituals or codes, but a door that exists in this very breath you are taking right now? A door that opens to peace so profound it has been described for centuries as nirvana. Yes, nirvana. Many imagine nirvana as some mystical paradise far beyond reach, reserved only for monks in robes, for saints meditating in caves, for enlightened beings long gone. But the truth is far more simple and far more astonishing. Nirvana can be touched the moment you are fully here, fully alive, fully present. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." In that presence, the flames of suffering cool, the storms of the mind settle, and a quiet joy shines through. That is the taste of nirvana. But here's the tragedy of modern life. We have forgotten how to be here. We have mastered the art of doing, of planning, of achieving. But we have lost the art of being. Think about it. When was the last time you ate a meal without scrolling on your phone, without watching a screen, without racing through it to get to the next thing? When was the last time you walked outside and truly felt the ground beneath your feet, the air against your skin, the sky stretching above you? Most of us cannot remember. We are present in body but absent in spirit. This absence is why we suffer so deeply. We think peace will come when we finally finish all our tasks, when we finally arrive. But peace has never been in the future. It has always been right here, waiting in the simple miracle of this moment. Picture this, a lake at dawn. The water is restless, rippling from the winds of yesterday and the storms of tomorrow. You cannot see the reflection of the moon because the surface is disturbed. But as the winds calm, the water grows still, and suddenly there it is. The full moon, clear and perfect, shining right back at you. This is the mind. When scattered in regrets of the past and fears of the future, it cannot reflect truth. But when it rests in the now, it reveals nirvana, always there, always shining, only hidden by the ripples. And here's the beautiful paradox. Nirvana is not something to chase. The harder you run after it, the further it seems. But when you stop running, when you simply breathe, when you fully inhabit this moment, you discover it has been with you all along. In Buddhist practice, this is the essence of mindfulness. Not a technique to escape reality, but a way to enter reality fully without distraction. To drink tea and taste only tea. To walk and feel each step as a miracle. To breathe and know you are alive. This is not theory, this is practice. And when practiced, it transforms. Anxiety begins to lose its grip, anger dissolves, craving quiets down. You become lighter, freer, more alive. And in these moments, however brief, you touch nirvana. Now, some may ask, if it's that simple, why doesn't everyone experience it? Because simplicity is the hardest thing to accept in a world addicted to complication. We believe freedom must be earned, enlightenment must be extraordinary, happiness must be bought. Yet the Buddha pointed to the most ordinary thing of all, this moment. There is a hidden door right here, right now. Most people walk past it every day, blinded by distraction. But if you pause, if you open your awareness, if you dare to be fully present, you will find it. And stepping through this door is not stepping into something new. It is stepping back into what you always were, free, whole, at peace. This is the invitation of the present. This is the whisper of nirvana. And once you begin to sense it, you may wonder, what exactly is this presence? What does it mean to be here? How does it differ from merely existing, and why is it so powerful that it opens the door to nirvana itself? To answer that, let's journey deeper. So here we are standing before the hidden door of the present moment. But before we step through, we need to ask, what does it really mean to be present? Most people think presence simply means being physically in a place. You're sitting in a room, your body is there, so you're present, right? But presence in the Buddhist sense goes far deeper. It is not just the body being here. It is the mind, the heart, and the spirit arriving fully too. Think of it this way. How many times have you spoken to someone while your thoughts were drifting elsewhere? You nodded, you said yes, but you didn't really hear them. Your body was there, but you were not. That absence is what robs life of its richness. Presence is the opposite. It is the art of arriving fully in this moment, so completely that nothing is left behind, nothing is ahead. The Buddha used the word sati, often translated as mindfulness. But sati is not just paying attention. It is remembering to return, remembering that life is only here, never there. Along with sampajanya, clear comprehension, it forms a way of living where you are no longer sleepwalking through life, but awake in it. Presence is more than awareness. Awareness can be passive. You can be aware you're stressed, aware you're eating, aware you're scrolling endlessly. But presence is active. It is awareness filled with intimacy. It is tasting the food with full attention, feeling the breath with gratitude, listening to a friend with your whole being. This kind of presence transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. A sip of tea becomes a ceremony. A step on the ground becomes a miracle. Even washing dishes becomes a meditation, where the warm water against your skin is enough to make you smile. But why is this so powerful? Because suffering cannot exist when the mind is fully present. Regret needs the past. Anxiety needs the future. Desire needs an imagined elsewhere. Strip all of that away and suffering has no soil to grow in. What remains is peace, immediate, simple, and profound. Let me tell you a story. There was once a monk who asked the Buddha, "What is the essence of your teaching in a single word?" The Buddha replied, "Awareness." The monk pressed further, "And what does awareness lead to?" The Buddha smiled and said, "To freedom." That freedom is not somewhere else. It is here, hidden in the depth of presence. But let's bring this down to our lives today. Imagine sitting with your child or your partner or a close friend. You could be physically together for hours, but if your mind is distracted, lost in emails, worries, or your phone, what have you really shared? Almost nothing. Now imagine instead being fully present, looking into their eyes, listening deeply, feeling the energy of the moment. Just 5 minutes like this may be more nourishing than 5 hours of distracted company. Presence is the true gift we give to each other, and presence is also the gift we give to ourselves. When you walk and know you are walking, when you breathe and know you are breathing, when you rest and allow yourself to truly rest, something subtle shifts. You reconnect with the flow of life itself. The universe no longer feels distant. You and this moment become one. But here lies the challenge. Our world teaches us to do, not to be. We measure life by productivity, by how much we achieve, by how fast we move. In this rush, we confuse existing with living, but existing is not enough. To exist is to survive. To be present is to live. Presence asks for courage. Courage to stop running. Courage to face yourself without distraction. Courage to feel what is here, even if it is uncomfortable. But in that courage lies the doorway to nirvana, a peace untouched by circumstances. Presence does not mean life becomes perfect. It means you are no longer trapped by imperfection. Joys are brighter, pains are lighter, and even sorrow is held with compassion. Presence transforms not by changing the world around you, but by changing the way you meet the world. So when we say, "Be here now," it is not a cliché. It is an instruction, a path, a revolution. And once you begin to taste the richness of this presence, you may begin to ask, if presence has such power, what exactly is this nirvana it points to? Is it a place, a state, a mystery beyond words? Let's step closer to that mystery. We've begun to feel the power of presence, the richness of arriving fully in the moment. But what does it mean to touch something called nirvana? Is it a distant paradise? A reward for future devotion? Or is it something far more subtle, a freedom that exists here now, waiting quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life? Nirvana, as taught by the Buddha, is not a place. It is not a heaven to be reached after death. It is not a castle perched on clouds for only the righteous. Nirvana is a state of being, a profound liberation from the forces that bind the mind, craving, aversion, and ignorance. It is the extinguishing of suffering, the cooling of the fires that burn within us. Imagine a fire consuming a forest. Smoke clouds the sky, heat blisters the earth, and the flames roar uncontrollably. Craving, aversion, and ignorance are like that fire in our own hearts. Desire pushes us to chase endlessly. Aversion pushes us to push away, to resist, to fight. Ignorance keeps us from seeing what is real, trapping us in illusions of permanence in a world that is ever-changing. Nirvana is not the fire itself. It is the moment the flames finally rest. It is the calm that follows when the smoke clears and the air is fresh and clear. This is why Nirvana is often described as the unconditioned. It is not shaped by success or failure, by praise or blame. It is not affected by wealth or status, by health or sickness. It simply is. And yet, paradoxically, it is always experienced in the most ordinary moments. A breath fully observed, a step fully taken, a mind fully aware. Some may ask, if Nirvana is so ordinary, why is it considered the highest goal? The answer is simple. Ordinary moments are the gateway to extraordinary freedom. We have been trained to overlook them, to chase after grandeur, to believe that fulfillment lies in the future. But Nirvana is a radical reorientation. It says, look here, look now, this is enough, this is complete. There is a story of a wandering monk who arrived at a village in despair. He had studied scriptures, meditated for years, and sought enlightenment far and wide. Yet nothing brought peace. One day, exhausted, he sat by a quiet stream, simply watching the water flow. For the first time, he was not chasing, not resisting, not striving. He was fully present, and in that silence, he felt a profound release, a freedom he had never known. That was Nirvana. Notice how subtle it is. It does not strike with fireworks or dramatic revelation. It is quiet, like a soft current beneath the surface, moving through the mind and settling it. It is freedom, but not freedom from life. Rather, it is freedom within life, unshakable, unwavering, and radiant. The Buddha often spoke of Nirvana as nibbana, literally blowing out. The fires of attachment and suffering are blown out, and what remains is clarity, peace, and bliss not dependent on external circumstances. It is a liberation that no one can give you and no one can take away. It is discovered only when you stop clinging, when you cease resisting, and when you fully inhabit the present moment. This is why presence and nirvana are inseparable. When the mind is fully here, fully aware, it is free from the illusions that cause suffering. When you stop running after the past or future, when you stop holding on to what cannot last, you touch the essence of liberation. Every fully present breath, every moment of genuine awareness is a doorway into this freedom. And yet, nirvana is not just the absence of suffering. It is the presence of something extraordinary, clarity, compassion, and joy that arise naturally when the mind is no longer entangled. Imagine the first rays of sunlight spilling into a dark room, revealing its colors, its textures, its life. That is the awakening of the mind in nirvana, a revelation not added from outside but uncovered from within. The challenge, of course, is that the mind is rarely still on its own. Our habitual cravings, fears, and attachments keep it restless. But this is where the practice of presence comes in, guiding us gently, moment by moment, into the realization that freedom is already here, waiting in the simplicity of now. So, what is nirvana truly? It is freedom. Freedom from the fire of suffering, freedom from the illusion of lack, freedom from the endless chase of more. And the remarkable secret is this: it is always accessible, always near, always waiting in the embrace of the present moment. And now that we begin to glimpse the nature of this profound liberation, we are naturally led to the question, why do we so often fail to see it? Why does our mind wander endlessly, blind to the freedom that is so close at hand? We've glimpsed the door to presence and touched the edge of nirvana, but most of us still miss it. Why? Why does the mind, so capable of awareness, wander endlessly, leaving us restless and unfulfilled? Buddhists call it the monkey mind. Picture a mischievous monkey leaping from branch to branch, never pausing, always grabbing, always restless. That is the human mind when it is untamed. Thoughts jump, cravings arise, fears whisper, memories replay. Even when we try to be present, the mind scurries off, dragging us with it into the past or hurling us into imagined futures. And it's no accident. The mind has evolved to protect us, to anticipate threats, to seek rewards. Craving pushes us to chase resources, aversion warns us away from danger, and fear keeps us alert. In a world of scarcity, these instincts kept us alive. But in the modern world, they often keep us trapped, chasing, worrying, comparing, judging while the present moment slips quietly away. Think about a day in your own life. You wake up to an alarm, check messages before even opening your eyes, and scroll through notifications as though survival depends on it. At work, your mind flits between tasks, deadlines, and future plans. Even when you try to meditate, thoughts intrude. Did I lock the door? I need to send that email. I'm late, I'm behind, I'm not enough. This is the monkey mind at work, clever, relentless, and charmingly convincing. It whispers, you must think, you must do, you must worry, all while stealing you from the miracle of simply being here. And yet the monkey mind is not our enemy. It is simply untrained. Imagine a dog that runs wildly in a garden. You don't scold it endlessly. You train it, guide it, teach it where to go and when to rest. The mind is the same. Through awareness, patience, and practice, we can calm the leaps and bounds of thought. We can invite the monkey to sit beside us quietly, to enjoy the view of the present moment. Modern life, however, has 1,000 tricks to keep it agitated. Social media, constant notifications, endless obligations, each one a swing from branch to branch, pulling our attention in all directions. We forget the stillness that is always here, that is always waiting beneath the chatter. There is a tale of a student who came to the Buddha complaining of distraction. I cannot focus, master. My mind races day and night, he said. The Buddha gave him a simple instruction. Watch your thoughts as if they were clouds in the sky. Let them drift. Do not chase them, do not push them away, just observe. At first the student laughed. Clouds, he thought, but as days passed he began to notice something profound. The clouds moved, the storms passed, and in the spaces between he glimpsed sky vast, calm, and untouched. That was the beginning of presence. That was the mind settling into freedom. We miss the present because we confuse it with boredom or emptiness. We think that if the mind is quiet, we are missing something. But true presence is never empty. It is alive, radiant, and deeply nourishing. When we allow thoughts to settle, when we stop chasing distractions, the richness of life emerges. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. Each breath, each step, each glance is infused with awareness. And here's a subtle secret. The more you resist the monkey mind, the more it leaps. The more you chase calm, the more chaos seems to follow. But when you acknowledge it, greet it, and return your attention gently to the present moment, the mind begins to trust stillness. It learns to rest in the now. So, the question arises, if our mind has been trained for distraction, how do we awaken it to presence? How do we move from chaos to clarity? How do we guide the monkey to sit quietly beneath the tree of awareness, allowing the hidden door to nirvana to open fully? The answer lies in the practices of presence, simple, consistent, and transformative steps that train the mind to settle, to see clearly, and to touch freedom. We have walked through the landscape of presence and glimpsed the doorway to nirvana. We've met the restless monkey mind and understood the subtle art of truly being here. But now, let's step into a place where ancient wisdom meets modern insight, the science of presence. It may surprise you, but what Buddhists have taught for over 2,000 years, the transformative power of being fully present, is now being confirmed by neuroscience and psychology, and the findings are nothing short of remarkable. When we practice presence or mindfulness, studies show that our brains begin to change. The prefrontal cortex, the area associated with attention, focus, and executive function, becomes stronger. The amygdala, the region that triggers stress and fear, becomes calmer. Simply put, being present rewires the mind to respond to life with clarity rather than panic. And it doesn't stop there. People who practice mindfulness report lower levels of anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. They experience better sleep, more emotional resilience, and even a stronger immune system. In other words, presence isn't just philosophy, it's biology. Your body and mind are built to flourish when you fully inhabit the now. Consider Sarah, a busy executive. She was constantly anxious, juggling endless emails, deadlines, and family obligations. Her mind never rested. One day she tried a simple mindfulness practice, 5 minutes of focused breathing each morning. At first, it felt strange, the mind raced, the body fidgeted. But over weeks, something shifted. She noticed herself pausing before reacting, listening more deeply to her colleagues, and finding moments of calm in the chaos. Her stress didn't vanish overnight, but her relationship to it transformed. She was present, and in that presence she discovered freedom. Psychologists call this phenomenon flow. Flow is the state in which we are so fully absorbed in the present moment that time seems to dissolve. There is no worry about the past, no anticipation of the future, only complete engagement. Flow, like mindfulness, creates joy, creativity, and profound satisfaction. It's no coincidence that Buddhist meditation and modern flow research arrive at similar conclusions. The mind is happiest when it is fully here. And then there is the physical impact. Brain imaging shows that regular mindfulness practice thickens areas of the brain associated with empathy and compassion. It strengthens connections that allow us to respond to life with clarity and warmth rather than reactivity. Stress hormones decrease, heart rates stabilize, even chronic pain becomes easier to bear. Presence literally transforms the body from the inside out. The wisdom of the Buddha and the findings of science converge beautifully here. The mind, when anchored in the present, is a gateway to freedom. Nirvana, as the Buddha described, is not just a spiritual ideal. It is a state our minds are capable of experiencing, confirmed by both centuries of meditation practice and the latest research in neuroscience. And yet, the power of presence is subtle. Science shows that even a few minutes of focused attention can reduce stress, but consistent practice is what leads to profound transformation. Just as muscles grow stronger through repeated exercise, the mind strengthens through repeated attention to the present. Each breath, each step, each moment of awareness is like a weight lifted, lightening the load of mental chatter and emotional turbulence. This is the bridge between the wisdom of old and the discoveries of today. It tells us presence is not mystical, it is practical, it is tangible, and it is available to anyone, anywhere, at any time. But knowing the science is one thing. Feeling it, experiencing it, integrating it into life, that is another. How do we move from understanding to practice? How do we translate these insights into moments of true freedom and peace? The answer lies in stories of lived experience, in real moments where presence transforms pain into clarity, anxiety into calm, and ordinary life into glimpses of the extraordinary. We've seen the science of presence and glimpsed its transformative power. But numbers and studies, while compelling, can never capture the full richness of experience. For that, we turn to stories, the lived lessons of those who have truly touched the present moment. One of the most striking tales comes from the life of the Buddha himself. There is the story of Angulimala, a feared bandit who had taken countless lives. He was known as a monster, a terror to villages, and yet he met the Buddha on a path one day. Instead of scolding, chasing, or condemning him, the Buddha simply walked mindfully, fully present in each step, fully aware of the moment, radiating compassion. Angulimala, confronted not with force but with presence, stopped. He could not resist the power of the moment, the clarity and peace emanating from a fully awake being. In that encounter, Angulimala transformed. He laid down his weapons and began the path of a monk. discovering the freedom that comes not from punishment or fear, but from presence, from being fully aware of the now. Notice something remarkable. The Buddha didn't teach Angulimala through argument or doctrine. He taught through being. Presence itself became the teacher, and the lesson was received in the silence between breaths, in the stillness of awareness. But we don't need to travel back 2.5 millennia to find such examples. In our modern world, presence works in subtle yet equally profound ways. Consider a physician working in a chaotic hospital. A patient enters, frightened and in pain. The physician, trained to multitask, might instinctively check monitors, scan charts, prepare medications. But if the doctor pauses, takes a breath, and gives undivided attention to the patient, listening, making eye contact, acknowledging fear, healing begins. Not through medicine alone, but through presence, through the act of being fully here with another human being. Or think of a parent with a restless child. Toys scattered, dishes in the sink, deadlines looming. The mind urges them to do, to finish, to control. Yet when the parent slows down, meets the child's eyes, listens to every word, every squeal of delight, something shifts. The child feels seen, loved, connected. And the parent discovers a calm joy that was hidden in the rush of routine. Presence, simple and unadorned, becomes a portal to liberation, a taste of nirvana in daily life. Even the smallest acts carry the potential for profound awareness. Drinking tea slowly, feeling each sip, walking barefoot on the earth, listening to the wind or the rain. These are not trivial acts, they are invitations to awaken. The mind begins to settle, the heart softens, and the ordinary moment reveals its extraordinary depth. Stories of presence also remind us that transformation does not require perfection. None of these figures, ancient or modern, are immune to distraction or suffering. The difference is their willingness to return to the moment, again and again. Like a river carving a canyon, consistent attention slowly reshapes the landscape of the mind. Each return to the present is a small revolution, a microcosm of nirvana unfolding in everyday life. Consider a musician lost in practice. Each note, each pause, each breath is attended to fully. In that absorption, time disappears, self-consciousness fades, and a clarity emerges, a flow that is both ordinary and sublime. The musician touches something beyond themselves, not by reaching, but by being utterly present. Presence is contagious. When we are fully present, others feel it. Compassion spreads effortlessly. Tension melts. Clarity shines. And in that ripple, even those who are unaware of the practice themselves are touched by it. It is a quiet revolution, invisible yet undeniable. Through these stories, from Angulimala to the modern parent, from the physician to the musician, we begin to understand that presence is not abstract. It is tangible. It is lived. And it is available to everyone willing to stop, breathe, and fully inhabit the moment. And now, after witnessing the transformative power of presence in action, the next question naturally arises. How do we cultivate it for ourselves? How do we turn these stories into daily practice, moment by moment, until the mind rests and nirvana is no longer distant, but felt, tasted, and lived? We've heard the stories, seen the science, and glimpsed the freedom of presence. Now comes the most important question. How do we bring it into our own lives? How do we move from understanding to experience, from theory to practice, from chaos to stillness? Presence is not magic. It is a skill. Like any skill, it can be developed, trained, and strengthened one breath, one step, one moment at a time. And the beauty of it is that you don't need a monastery, a mountain, or years of study. Presence begins wherever you are with whatever you have right now. One of the simplest and most profound practices is mindful breathing. It sounds basic, but it is revolutionary. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and focus on the rhythm of your breath. Notice the rise and fall of your chest. Feel the air entering your nostrils, leaving your body. Thoughts will arise, that's natural. When they do, gently return your attention to the breath. No judgment, no frustration, just return. Each return is a step closer to presence. Walking meditation is another powerful practice. You don't need a trail in the mountains, a hallway, a garden, even a sidewalk will do. Walk slowly, deliberately. Feel each step, the weight of your feet, the connection to the earth. Notice the sensations in your body, the subtle movements you usually overlook. Your mind becomes anchored in the simple miracle of walking. Eating can also become a meditation. In our rush, meals are often consumed absent-mindedly, while emails or screens demand attention. But when we eat mindfully, we notice colors, textures, aromas, and flavors. Each bite becomes a universe of sensation. Each swallow an opportunity to return to the present. Even something as ordinary as a meal transforms into a gateway to awareness. And then there's the practice of pausing. Modern life pushes us to do, rarely allowing a moment to simply be. But even a single pause, a conscious inhalation, a soft exhalation can be profound. Pause before reacting to a stressful email. Pause before speaking in frustration. Pause before rushing to the next task. Each pause is a mini reunion with the present, a gentle step towards stillness. Stillness is not the absence of activity. It is the presence of awareness. It is the mind fully awake in each movement, fully alert in each pause. And as the mind settles, something remarkable happens. The noise of distraction diminishes, clarity grows, and a subtle joy emerges. A joy rooted not in circumstances, but in the richness of the moment itself. But these practices are not always easy. The monkey mind will resist. Thoughts, cravings, and distractions will leap relentlessly. The key is consistency and gentleness. We return again and again, like a river flowing around stones, gradually carving a path to peace. Each practice strengthens the mind, builds resilience, and deepens the experience of presence. Consider Maria, a teacher juggling classrooms, grading, and family life. She began with just 5 minutes of mindful breathing each morning. Some days she forgot. Some days her mind ran wild. But slowly these moments accumulated. She began noticing herself responding rather than reacting, listening rather than judging, smiling rather than frowning. Her days were still busy, but she had discovered a space of stillness within them, a sanctuary of presence that could not be disturbed by the outer chaos. And the most profound part, this stillness was not separate from life. It was life itself, fully engaged, fully awake, fully alive. Presence is not an escape. It is a deep, intimate encounter with reality as it is. Through these simple yet profound practices, mindful breathing, walking, eating, pausing, the mind learns to settle, to rest in awareness, to meet each moment fully. And as this practice deepens, the glimpses of nirvana become more frequent, more vivid, more alive. Once we understand and embody these steps into stillness, the ordinary transforms into the extraordinary. Pain becomes bearable, joy becomes brighter, and freedom, true freedom, begins to unfold. And as we cultivate these practices, we naturally begin to notice the moments where presence touches liberation directly. The stillness is no longer a distant goal. It is a living reality, waiting in every breath, every step, every heartbeat. Now, having explored the ways to practice presence, the natural next step is to understand what happens when presence becomes profound, when it touches the very essence of freedom itself. We have learned to cultivate presence, to anchor the mind in each breath, each step, each pause. We have practiced mindfulness in ordinary acts, gently training the restless mind. But now comes a glimpse of something extraordinary. The moments when presence unfolds into liberation, when we taste nirvana, however fleetingly, in the ordinary flow of life. Imagine a quiet morning. You sit by a window, the sun spilling softly across the floor. Your breath is steady, your mind settled. A gentle bird call rises from the garden. You notice the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the rhythm of your heartbeat, the subtle peace of simply being. There is no striving, no chasing, no resisting. Only awareness, only life. And in that awareness, a profound freedom arises, a freedom untouched by past regrets or future anxieties. These moments are subtle. They do not scream, they do not dazzle, they whisper. They are like glimpses of the moon reflected in a still lake, perfectly clear, yet easily missed if the water ripples with distraction. And yet when we notice them, they leave a mark on the heart. The Buddha described nirvana as the extinguishing of the fires of craving, aversion, and ignorance. But it is not emptiness in the sense of nothingness. It is fullness. It is clarity. It is a liberation so profound that even suffering loses its grip. Even sorrow is softened. Even joy shines with an unshakable radiance. Consider the story of a monk walking through a village. He pauses to observe a simple flower blooming. Others may pass without noticing, distracted by daily concerns, but the monk's attention is fully present. In this brief encounter, he experiences a taste of freedom, a deep connection to the life around him, an absence of the usual turbulence of thought, a gentle knowing that all is as it should be. In modern life, these moments are no less real. A parent playing with a child, fully attentive, laughing together without distraction, discovers a freedom that no schedule, no duty, no worry can take away. A musician lost in melody, a painter absorbed in color, a writer immersed in words. In these acts of deep presence, time dissolves, self-consciousness fades, and a profound joy emerges. This is nirvana glimpsed in everyday life. And the remarkable thing is that these moments are not rare exceptions. They are available to anyone who practices presence consistently. Each fully attended breath, each conscious step, each act of deep listening brings us closer to this freedom. The mind learns to rest, the heart learns to open, and life itself becomes a sacred, vibrant unfolding. Yet freedom is not simply the absence of difficulty. Pain still arises. Loss still touches us. Life is not magically painless. But in the taste of nirvana, suffering is no longer a prison. It is seen, felt, and held with compassion, yet it does not consume us. This is the subtle, profound difference between fleeting pleasure and true liberation. Presence transforms ordinary experience into sacred awareness. A cup of tea, a walk in the park, a quiet moment of solitude, all become opportunities to encounter the taste of freedom. Each moment is a doorway. Each moment is a reminder that nirvana is not somewhere far away, not a reward at the end of a long journey. It is here in the breath, in the step, in the awareness that you are alive. As we begin to recognize these moments, we see that presence is not only a personal experience. It shapes the way we relate to the world, the way we move through relationships, responsibilities, and society itself. Freedom is not isolated, it radiates. And the question naturally arises, how can we live presence consistently in the midst of the busy, noisy, demanding world around us? We have seen the taste of nirvana, those fleeting moments of freedom where the mind rests and the heart opens. But life rarely allows us to linger in solitude forever. The world is busy, noisy, demanding. Work, family, obligations, digital distractions, they pull us in every direction. The question then becomes, how do we bring presence into the chaos of daily life? Presence is not about escaping society or retreating from responsibility. It is about carrying the clarity, the calm, the awareness we cultivate in meditation into every interaction, every task, every moment. Presence transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. It allows us to be fully alive even in the busiest environments. Consider a crowded train during rush hour. Most of us focus on discomfort, the noise, the crush of bodies, the impatience. But someone practicing presence notices differently. They feel the rhythm of their breath, observe the movement of people without judgment, perhaps even catch the glint of sunlight through the window. The world remains busy, but the mind is calm. The chaos no longer controls them. They respond, not react. Presence in society is also about relationships. Listening deeply, speaking with awareness, acting with intention, these simple practices transform how we connect. Imagine a conversation with a friend or colleague. You are fully attentive, not planning your next words or distracted by your phone. You feel their words, notice their emotions, respond with clarity. Presence creates connection, empathy, and understanding. It is a subtle yet profound ripple that extends far beyond ourselves. There's the story of a teacher in a bustling classroom. Chaos surrounds her. Students chatter, deadlines loom, parents call, yet she remains fully present with each child. One by one, she notices their struggles, celebrates their victories, and responds with patience and care. The children, sensing her attention, blossom. The classroom becomes a sanctuary, not because the world outside changed, but because her presence transformed the environment. Similarly, presence in the workplace shifts dynamics. A leader who responds with clarity rather than stress, who communicates mindfully, who makes decisions rooted in awareness, influences the entire organization. Presence is not passive. It is active, transformative, and contagious. Technology, of course, is a double-edged sword. It can distract us endlessly, scattering attention, or it can serve as a tool for mindful living if used consciously. Checking emails or social media with awareness, taking deliberate pauses between notifications, using devices with intention. These small acts train the mind to return to the present, even in a hyper-connected world. And yet, life will always demand more than we feel capable of giving. Presence does not eliminate challenges or obligations. Instead, it changes our relationship to them. Tasks are no longer burdens. Interactions are no longer exhausting. Challenges become opportunities to practice awareness and compassion. Presence transforms the ordinary pressures of life into a field of meditation, a canvas for awareness. Think of a parent juggling work and family. The day is hectic, deadlines press, children cry, phones ring. Yet, by bringing presence into each moment, truly seeing the child, feeling the breath between tasks, noticing the warmth of sunlight or the aroma of a meal, life shifts. The parent discovers that the world, though busy, is not an enemy. It becomes a stage where awareness can flourish, where freedom can be tasted, where moments of nirvana can appear unexpectedly. So, living presence in a busy world is not about finding time for meditation alone. It is about weaving awareness into every facet of life. It is bringing solitude into society, mindfulness into the mundane, calm into chaos. And as we do this, we discover something remarkable. Nirvana is not confined to quiet retreats or rare experiences. It is available here now in the flow of daily life, for anyone willing to notice, breathe, and return to the present. As we prepare to close this journey, the question emerges. How do we integrate all we've learned, the awareness, the stillness, the glimpses of freedom, into a life that is truly awake, compassionate, and free? The answer and the final chapter will guide us home. And now we arrive at the final chapter of our journey, though in truth, presence is not a path with an end. It is a living, breathing experience, moment by moment. It is not a destination to reach, but a reality to awaken to. We have explored the hidden door, the power of now, the restless monkey mind, the science and stories of presence, and the practices that anchor us in stillness. We have glimpsed nirvana in fleeting moments, tasted freedom in ordinary life, and learned to bring presence into the chaos of the world. And now we stand at the threshold with one simple, profound truth. The door is already open. Nirvana is not somewhere out there. It is not a prize to earn, a reward for effort, or a distant realm beyond the clouds. It exists here now in the awareness of your breath, the feeling of your body, the clarity of your mind. It exists in the gentle noticing of life as it is, unfiltered and unjudged. You do not need to chase it, struggle for it, or wait for it. You only need to recognize it, to step through the door that has always been waiting. Imagine standing at a doorway, sunlight spilling through the frame. For years, you may have thought the door was locked, that some key was missing, that freedom lay beyond distant effort. But as you pause, breathe, and notice, you realize the door swings freely. You step forward and the world does not change, you do. The moment you enter, every step, every breath, every heartbeat becomes the doorway itself. The Buddha said, "There is no path to nirvana, nirvana is the path." Presence is both the journey and the arrival. Every mindful breath, every attentive action, every conscious pause is a step into liberation. Every moment fully lived is nirvana in practice. And yet, walking into nirvana is not about perfection. The mind will wander, thoughts will arise, life will pull you in countless directions. but each return to the present, each gentle act of awareness is a reaffirmation of freedom. The door remains open, waiting for you to step through again and again, moment by moment. Consider the ripple effect. When you live with presence, your clarity, calm, and compassion touch others. Your relationships deepen. Your actions become aligned with kindness and understanding. The world becomes not a battlefield of distraction, but a canvas for awareness. Presence is both personal liberation and shared blessing. So, what does it mean to truly walk into nirvana? It means living fully here and now. It means noticing the ordinary and discovering the extraordinary. It means breathing, seeing, listening, and feeling with the fullness of your being. It means touching freedom in the simplest moments, a smile, a step, a breath, and realizing that these moments are infinite, eternal, and always available. The journey does not end with this chapter. Life itself is the practice, the teacher, the doorway. Every day, every moment, every encounter is an invitation to awaken, to return, to be present. And as you step into this awareness, you carry with you a profound truth. The hidden door was never hidden. The key was never lost. The freedom you seek has always been here, waiting in the eternal now. Breathe, step forward, open your heart, walk fully into the moment, and in doing so, you step into nirvana here, now, and always. The door is open. The journey is eternal. Presence is life itself. If this journey into presence and the taste of freedom resonated with you, consider joining us on Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you can continue exploring the profound teachings of the Buddha, stories of mindfulness and practices that guide you toward peace and clarity. Every moment you return to the present is a step into liberation. Every breath of awareness is a reminder that freedom is always here now. By being part of this community, you allow yourself to grow, to reflect, and to awaken gently, steadily, deeply. And if you found value in this video, leave a comment or share it with someone who might benefit. Together, we can create a space where presence, calm, and wisdom flow freely, one moment at a time. Remember, the door is always open. Take a breath, step into the now, and keep walking this path of awareness.